Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a busy day with Halloween coming up, so we appreciate you taking the hour or so with us on this great grantsmanship training. My name is Omer Ramil. I'm with the Greenlights Grant Initiative. We understand that collecting data for federal grant applications can be really challenging. And so our goal today is that you walk away feeling more confident on how to search for and use data to prepare your competitive grant applications. Matthew and Camilla McConaughey are really excited that you're joining us in this effort to make sure that America's students are safe, secure, and healthy. We all know that every one of us has a role to play. These slides, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be sent out to you shortly after it wraps. So be ready to receive that. And with that, I'd like to share a message that Matthew wanted to share with you.
Hi, everybody. McConaughey here with the Greenlights Grant Initiative. I want to welcome you to the Making Your Case with Data webinar. Today, you will learn more about the tools available to utilize data in your district's grant application. We hope you're going to leave this webinar better equipped to use data to prepare a more competitive federal grant application. Thank you again for joining. In the meantime and all times, just keep living. Hi, everybody. McConaughey.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Welcome to How to Make Your Case with Data. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Julie Assel, and I've actually been a writer for nearly 20 years now, managing grants. I hold the Grant Professional Certified Credential through the Grant Professional Certification Institute, and I'm an approved trainer through the Grant Professionals Association. But it's actually probably my experience as the coordinator of grants for the Kansas City, Missouri School District that will probably provide more of the background information to how I come to know all of this, because I've been in your shoes. I've been writing grants with little bit of data, with a lot of data, being overwhelmed by data, not knowing what data to choose, what data would actually help me really convey the importance of this work. And it's really, as we go through the process today, know that what I'm telling you is done through 20 years of experience working with school districts and safety, mental health, all of these types of issues. Next slide. I'm delighted to join you today because I believe that data is a powerful way of showing why a program is needed and how it can help benefit the people that it will serve. Finally, data in general and the data specifically that you select to present can shape how you will measure a program's outcomes and its impact. So it really is an important element of storytelling. It's also one of the elements in a grant application that can be confusing for many. Now, some may be wondering, well, where do I get the data? Or what kind of data should I use for a grant? Or we don't have any data, so what do we do now? So we're going to cover all of these questions and talk about how to use publicly available data and what kind of internal data you may already have that you can use. Yes, even if you think you don't have any data, the reality is you run a program in a school district, so you most likely do. Data is an essential part of the storytelling you do when crafting a grant application. As such, it should be considered not just early on, but often throughout the process. Data collection and analysis will be woven through the entire process of putting together a grant application and, frankly, managing the grant on the back end. Personally, I love data because it allows me as a writer to further illustrate the needs and thus make the case for a particular program or activities. So today we're going to discuss different types of data, how to leverage data that you already have, gather data that is publicly available, and really talk through some options of presenting that data once you have it. Next slide. Data is everywhere. Most of the things we do are in some way tracked or counted. And for the most of the federal funding opportunities that you may be looking at, there are federal agencies collecting and publishing raw data, or maybe even looking more about the work they fund through data. So it will be important for you to collect some of the data that already exists to make the case for the why of your program, and then to connect it to a larger body of work of similar organizations doing work that has already been funded by the federal government. So if you are seeking funds, you should know really well the people you are trying to help and why. Data can help with that, giving a quick summary of populations and some of their commonalities, as well as where they're located. But we'll get more in depth into that in just a minute. Next slide. Data is an essential part of telling a story for a general audience who is unfamiliar with your organization, your work, and why you do it. When you're in the process of defining your program, you'll want to answer the following general questions about it before you start writing. Who, what, where, and when. Or really in more detail, who benefits from the program? What are the activities within the program? Where will the program take place? And when will the program begin and end? Data is also important in helping you illustrate these answers. So for example, when we say, what is the program? I often hear people saying, what gets measured gets done, meaning the metrics you share will tell your audience what you already consider relevant. In defining your program, you're going to want to share some data to illustrate its benefits or operationalization, or specifically how it's being implemented. So in determining the scope of the program, gather data you collect, data you already have, data you would like to have, and of course, data from partners, if you have any. Now, if you're thinking, but what kind of data do I need? That's a great question. First, you're going to want to, again, determine the who, what, where, and when of your program. For instance, if you're looking at, let's say, a project on providing mental health services, you can mention who will benefit from that program. And here you'll want to be specific about the who. You want to mention the ages, maybe rural or urban populations, diversity in the makeup of the population, maybe average socioeconomic background, and any other markers that you will use to determine who will benefit from that program. This is part of the information you will need to collect then future data. Next, you will want to determine the geographic location for your project. This is not only where your organization is located, but also where the people you are serving will be coming from. For instance, if the services that you're providing are open to, let's say, the entire county or an entire school district, you can mention that early on. This will also be a way to limit the data you collect. Databases put out by the federal government or by independent agencies are plentiful. They're absolutely convenient and useful, but you can spend a lot of time researching. This is why having a clear who, what, when, and where of your program will help you navigate the research process from all kinds of sources. For instance, let's say you're serving some students and the research could lead you to every single state, but you might want to only know about the details of students in a couple of states in only, let's say, middle school. So the main subject is not the only way to search. You also need to have a clear idea of the population characteristics and their geographic location. So stop and think. Who will benefit? Where is the program located? When will the program take place? to help guide your research process and map out that story that you are telling within your proposal. Now, all of this, people often say, this sounds like a lot. I don't know even what my program is going to be. How do I even know what's out there and where to start? So depending on the type of project you're seeking funding for, you'll need to visit different types of data sources. The more common types of data across the board are national data sources, many of which we've put on this slide, and they are detailed enough to cover many of the themes you would want to cover in your grant application. For depicting things like socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic data of a community, or even looking at geographic differences, the US Census and its product, the American Community Survey, are very useful and user-friendly. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the census, but they always think of it as a 10-year time frame. The American Community Survey, on the other hand, produces annual and 5-year averages. If you've never retrieved data from either of these, I suggest that you look at the many webinars that they have posted on their website about how to create data summaries and charts. We also have some handouts on these sources that we've named and general handbook for new users that we're going to be sharing with you along with the PowerPoint. Another common and wide data repository is the National Center for Education Statistics. It's very comprehensive. We'll also have a handout that we'll send with the slide deck that explains how to navigate its site. In addition, the Center for Disease Control, which a lot of people were thinking, wait a second, this is safety. How do I end up with the Center for Disease Control? They actually have a lot of surveys addressing things like obesity, health, but also mental health, which depends on the program you're proposing, right? In addition, they've recently been basically allowed by Congress to study violence as a health statistic. They have something called Places. It's an expanded project that collects data on the county level. So you could easily find your own census tract and a point of comparison. There, you can download data by county, place, and census tract. Places also explores conditions, behaviors, risk factors that have a substantial effect on population health. Now, if you're applying to a grant, let's say managed by a state, you could then do a state level and county level comparison. Again, you want to think about your audience, right? So here you'll have maybe state level representatives or reviewers, and you'll want to highlight your region then in a more granular way as a comparison to that state data point. It's also helpful to consult things like peer review journals. They offer a wealth of information, and what's really, in my opinion, vital there is this data has already been analyzed and interpreted. So it gives you an opportunity to be able to say, am I on the right track here with how I see this data? And they also can really portray and kind of give some meta-analysis of what's happening on a national scale. Now, I will tell you that if you are talking to, for example, program staff early on, you might think about asking them questions about their subject matter expertise, because they then might be able to point you to specific databases that will be the most relevant for your project. Now, this data collection process can be cumbersome if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. So we want you to think about your objectives and your data as you go through this process. And it is really an iterative process. I'm starting out this presentation today by telling you about what sources are available so you know kind of where to start. Then as you create your project, you'll be able to continually kind of go back through and say, oh, well, I didn't know I needed this. Now I need to go back and I know where to look for it because I've seen that. To continue with databases that are available to make your case, next slide, I want to follow up with some examples that set up the safety environment, maybe from different perspectives. These topics are usually measured in something called incidents. For example, let's say that something happens within a school or a district and it gets reported. These types of databases can show trends or the incidents or environmental factors that contribute to a lack of safety. A lot of us have safety data in general, but these actually point to, well, this is why these things may be occurring. And this is especially helpful if you're maybe a small school district and you haven't really analyzed the why. It's helpful to be able to say, well, why is it happening in other places? Because we have the data, but maybe we don't know the why. And then we compare that information with, if we know the why of this incident is happening, here's a program that has been shown to make the problem numbers go down and the protective factors for our students, because we all want to prevent these incidences from happening, to go up, okay? There are also several resources that are survey data. It's all well and good when we take a look at what's called quantitative data, a bunch of numbers, but there are some more interesting data sets that you can also take a look at when you go to the survey level. This is really focused on maybe asking a specific group of people what they're experiencing within some category of safety. This quality data or qualitative data and research are increasingly essential to demonstrating that an observable activity is a cause for concern. But quality data can be, let's call it, difficult to access for some organizations, frankly, that are stretched thin and in need of additional manpower to carry out this task. So some of you may already have survey data that is very tied to your district, or even your building or a classroom or a situation. But this gives you some broader surveys that you can use as some data points, again, for those of you who may not have it already for yourself. But all of this data kind of points to having clear in your mind what you're trying to portray, what problem you're addressing, and who is that problem impacting the most. This will help you prioritize and really help out with this research process. So let's talk through some of these useful databases in the safety category. The first one on this list is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. This database, as I mentioned earlier, is one of them by the CDC. It's a good example of longitudinal data that's available to you. In it, students in grades 9 through 12 are asked a number of issues, including their involvement in physical fights, both in and out of school. The survey also tracks environmental factors to consider from the perspective of students. But it also includes things like parental monitoring, like from the student's perspective, do they feel like their parents are paying attention to what they're doing? Do they feel connected to their school? Do they have unstable housing? What exactly is their exposure to community violence? Now, you could lean on this type of data to tell a story about the environmental and community factors students face as told from their perspective. But I've also known people who've taken a look at this work and have instead looked at the survey and said, you know, I don't feel like this tells our story. But instead, they take a look at those questions and they then distribute a survey to a more maybe refined group of students who are experiencing a particular issue in their district that they hope that this grant will be able to address. Another data set is the school-associated violent death surveillance system. This database is also collected by the CDC, but it includes the K through 12 school shooting database, where school shootings are defined as incidents in which a gun is simply brandished or fired on school property, or a bullet hits school property, really for any reason, regardless of the number of victims, time of day, day of the week, or frankly, reason. This is an incident-based report and can help show maybe how isolated or how prevalent the problem of gun violence is, not just in a particular school or district, but also kind of points to what else is happening related to gun violence near a school. The next one is the National Crime Victimization Survey. This database is collected by the Department of Justice, and it includes non-fatal criminal victimization experiences by students ages 12 through 18, according to students' own reports. These non-fatal criminal victimization includes things like theft and violent victimization, the latter of which includes rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and simple assault. Since this is also told from the student's point of view, it can help create a backdrop for a particular program that seeks to address safety and includes students as part of the solution. This is also useful when there are issues of underreporting incidents, or data from local reports can be balanced with national data that showcases the extent of an issue from the student's perspective. Now, personally, I like to compare this data set, especially the criminal victimization data, with actually what I'm seeing from my local police department. You'll find that there's a lot of parallels. So I can give, well, this is what my police department says these data points are. This is what the students say that they're experiencing. The last one here that I'll talk about is the school survey on crime and safety. This survey is collected by the Department of Education. The survey asks public school principals to report the number of various types of criminal incidences that occurred at their school and to indicate how often disciplinary problems happened in the school. This database then can be compared with any of the student surveys to show really a 360-degree view of any particular safety issue at a local level, and then in comparison with state or at the national level, all within the same grade. So these databases provide many options for tailoring research that's already been done to present a particular problem within your own setting. They also provide an opportunity to show a point of comparison with what is happening in your setting. Is the problem worse for you? Is it on par with what your peers are experiencing? Or is it a widespread problem within a geographic location? Maybe that means you could do some outreach to your neighbors to come up with a common plan or a partnership. In any case, there are many ways to slice and dice the data and present it in a way that makes your program stand out. And I really like to be able to take a look at what else is going on in my region. I write a lot of partnership grants, and especially if I'm writing maybe for a small school district, a rural school district, maybe a charter school, a private school, they really sometimes feel very isolated in the data that they have, and they don't always feel comfortable in saying, this is a problem that exists everywhere. But if you can take a look at data points that say, oh, this is happening throughout my county, this allows you to be able to reach out and say, hey, I can see this data, even when that principal or that school district superintendent is not being very public about that because they're concerned about how it makes their district look. And instead, being able to come at this really from a proactive stance to say, we know that this problem is encroaching upon our neighborhoods, encroaching upon our districts. It's happening everywhere, and it's not just happening in the urban core. I've seen school districts, rural school districts. We worked with a place in Iowa, like the whole basically southwest corner of Iowa in one of these grants, where they brought together a whole bunch of districts to say, we know this is happening. If we tackle this on our own, it doesn't make sense for us to apply for this grant dollars because individually we don't really need that much money, and we're feeling that we're not going to be competitive to go after these grants. But they compiled their data together, they did a similar program, then they worked with their basically like their education agency to do the training out and about to them, and it made sense for them, and they were very competitive at the national level when it came to that grant application. Okay. So again, the point that we really try to make is, how do you make your program stand out? Now, next slide. In the coming year, many of you will choose to apply for federal grant funding, state funding. But for those that are looking at federal data sources, that's really going to allow you to compare your district situation with what is happening nationally. But the other half of that comparison is the data your district has. And this is called primary data. This is the data you produce day to day that you may have easy access to. And it's things like attendance records, enrollment rates, grades, etc. Basically anything that you have in your data, or maybe you're a district that has multiple databases and they don't always even talk to each other. And I've dealt with districts who have said things like, oh, I've got data, but we can't pull reports for anything. So all of these things are things that you want to think about, not just what data do you have, but how easy is it for you to access? And the reason I bring that up now is because we're at October, almost November, and most of these federal grants are going to be coming out in somewhere between January and June, probably due June, July-ish, right? And now is the time to be having those conversations to say, how can we access this data? I know I collect this data. You make us collect it, maybe for the state or for our district. How can I have a report for my building or my feeder school, set of feeder schools, something like that, and start figuring out how you want to slice and dice this data. For those of you who are new to writing grant proposals, there are really 3 important sections within a grant proposal which must align. And some of you will go back to me and say, well, there's lots of things, but regarding data, right? This is the need section, the program section, and the evaluation section. If you present something as a problem in the need section, your project then must or should address that problem. And then your evaluation of the project should also measure those same areas, which means that if you're presenting a data set here that says, we know that our district has this problem, check and see if you are still measuring that data point and proposing that data point in the evaluation section. Do yourself a favor. Try not to add more work to yourself and evaluate data that you're not already evaluating if it already tells your story. And there are reasons to add more tools on the evaluation side, but make sure that you're also taking a look and maybe wording your evaluation so that it makes sense with the problem in parallel, okay? Because we want all of these to match. Some grants have performance measures that must that you must meet, right? You're going to want to check the guidelines for each grant, because then you can use this to work backwards, say, okay, if these are the performance measures I must meet, then how much of a problem is that for, let's say, our organization, our school district? Maybe it helps you decide which of the buildings within your district are the ones that you're going to include in this grant if you can't include them all for financial reasons, right? And then design a program to address those problems. And of course, then you're showing improvement on those performance measures. Grants will also ask you to address your unique challenges. And for that, you must examine what you want to accomplish with the grant, really in parallel as you look at your data. So the first thing you should think about is, which population do you want to address? Once you know the population you're going to be serving through your program, or the who, you can then narrow down the data you collect internally just to that population. Your district may have many populations to choose from, whether that be kind of figured out by the student's age or their building or their geographic location in your district or your community, or they may be individuals with very specific challenges that may be located throughout your district. As you think about the who, you're going to want to describe this population for your reader. Now, for this, you can use the demographics you already collect and frankly have to report to your State Department of Education. Note, please make sure that you aren't presenting demographic data as the problem, but instead present this as a description of the population you will be serving. You want to check with whoever kind of is that reporting person in your district to see really how many ways there can be of presenting that data aside from what's already in the report. I don't know about you, but as someone who deals with reports put out by others, especially state departments of education, it can be frustrating to me because I'll go out to the state's website and I'll look up things like incident data for suspension or for various gun-related offenses or drug-related offenses, any of these types of things. But somehow the data that I want is not quite the way I want it, right? And I want to be able to manipulate that data a little bit different. So you may also be having these ongoing conversations to be able to say, well, how can we sort the data in a way that presents the case we're looking for? You will have some data that's pretty straightforward, right? The number of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And this could maybe supplement your census data on socioeconomic status. You will have incident data, which includes incidences of student discipline like expulsion or suspension or in-school suspension. These data points can, of course, be compared to some of the earlier safety databases that we discussed. Note that if you're working at the individual building level, you may also have data that really might not be easily put into a database. Some schools or districts are running programs that have data on classroom discipline challenges. This may include things like write-ups for conduct in a classroom, which then may, let's say, escalate to having the student take a break in another classroom. That a lot of times is called like a buddy room, perhaps, or referrals to the office before there are then calls home to a parent. Once again, you want to determine who you're serving and then think about this level of primary data as well. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, I worked for several years as a grant professional in an urban school district. But the flip side is I'm actually also a parent who has a child who has gone through some of these classroom behavior challenges. And frankly, this data I know can vary wildly from year to year, and not just because of the student makeup, but also the sensitivity of the teachers or of the administration. and depends on what building they're at, how quickly, for example, they report things home. It also may be impacted by the conduct or citizenship programs that you may be running in a building at this point. Now, a cautionary note, if you plan to use data like this in your need, first off, it's great data. It's very tailored, very immediate data. It has its challenges because a lot of times it isn't in a database easily drawn down. But if you plan to use data like this in your need, project, and evaluation sections, make sure that you plan to continue these programs throughout the life of your grant. Otherwise, you may find yourself without the data, right? It's great data, but because it's non-mandated data that you're proposing to put in your needs section, when you go to actually run the grant on the back end, I've absolutely been in situations where I've helped school districts with their grant management, and they said, yeah, I know that we proposed that, but then the superintendent decided that he was going to stop funding that particular thing, or, oh, we had a change of principle and that particular program was their passion point, and we're going to change to this other program instead. So that may cause a little bit of challenge when it comes to the evaluation of your grant. And you may want to make someone aware, oh, wait, guys, this data point, this evaluation tool is actually built into this grant application. And what will it take for us, at least maybe for this particular set of buildings, or maybe for the district to continue this for a little bit longer, okay? So somebody asked the question, what's the typical time duration expected for the life of a grant? When we deal with mental health, safety, security ones, there are some that are 1 year, but more of them are ranging about 3 years. I think there's 1 or 2 that goes out to 5, but they're getting to be pretty rare. Most of the time you're dealing in about the 3-year time frame. Okay. There are some grants though that are just 1 year, right? We saw a whole lot of money come down to each of the states through the Safer Communities Act. And a lot of those grants were just going to be 1 year grants. So that was a lot easier. But having worked through at a school district where we had a lot of superintendent turnover over the years that I was there, I saw a lot of programs come and go, and I became kind of sensitive to this issue. Okay. So the guidelines for each grant, since I mentioned that earlier, there are a lot of different grant opportunities, and these are listed out on Greenlights Initiative's website. But most of those grant opportunities won't actually come out until, well, it kind of varies, but we're in the new fiscal year, but we don't have a budget for the new fiscal year that started October 1. And so we're going to see some of those specific grant opportunities that are open, probably open in the January through March, maybe even April timeframe, which is one of the reasons it's so important to talk about data now, because if you have a grant that's coming out in April and you're looking at it then, to a certain degree, that's almost too late because you're busy with testing and the end of the school year. What I really recommend that you do is that you go out to the maybe grants.gov and check the previous or archived grants for the ones that they list out on Greenlight Grant's website, because you can take a look at past opportunities. You can't guarantee that they're going to be the exact same, but it will help you, again, see those performance measures, and you can get a good idea of what's really out there. Okay. Now, finally, there are a lot of surveys that you already collect, right? Parent and family engagement surveys, student surveys, maybe climate surveys, faculty climate surveys. these can help provide information about the most pressing issues within a particular school. And they can really show how these populations intersect with their environment. And then again, overall trends observed at the national level. These data points can help you make the case for the why of your proposed program. One way to think about how to use this data is to, again, narrow down the problem to maybe a simple phrase or statement that you can then illustrate with your data. And this goes back to this idea of, if you know that you have a problem right now and you're trying to drill down to that why, you can use some of those national surveys to maybe even come up with questions that you can then distribute through even something as simple as SurveyMonkey out to families, out to students, following whatever your FERPA protocols are, to be able to request information about how students feel about those types of things, or how parents feel about them, or how faculty feel about addressing some of these issues. Some of the grants that are out there are focused on things like training teachers on how they can respond to some of these issues. And so it can be very enlightening to know how the teachers feel about their qualifications about those things, where they would like to see more support. And these surveys can be incredibly helpful. Okay. Then you want to address the what of your program. What will you be doing? You want to showcase in the internal data the things that are happening, right? Really your baseline of information. And this is really interesting for some school districts because they're doing some things. Maybe they've already piloted something at a couple of schools, or they used to do something and then it went away. And some of those data points give you a baseline of, we know what we're doing now. We know it's producing this result. We either need to do more of that thing or we need to do a different thing because it's not working. Okay, so taking a look at what your baseline data tells you right now can be very helpful, because at this stage of your project design process, you can address what data you would like to have to be able to truly measure the outcomes you're going to be proposing to accomplish through this program. Because you can absolutely say, we know we have this problem and we're going to fine-tune what we learn, because maybe we don't have that data in our need, but we're going to figure it out by the end. You can also take a look at whether, let's say you don't have a particular data point, let's talk about some setbacks, right? Let's say you find out that you have too much data, or it's hard to pull, or you don't have enough data because maybe you have some kind of staffing concern, or there isn't really a paper trail, right? These are all common scenarios that I've worked with various school districts and I've encountered, right? So what will be helpful here is if you can narrow down exactly what you need to provide to make your program stand out. So if you want to say, well, I want to know the attendance for 6th through 9th grade students who are receiving mental health services. I want to know, let's say, their demographics. And because it's mental health data, maybe you can't actually slice the data that finely, because the system that you have that talks about student demographics is not the same confidential system where you keep your mental health data, okay? So what you might be able to do then is to be able to infer from full school data that's already, reported, that what you might be encountering with your mental health services. Is it perfect? No, but you might then be able to propose, let's say in your grant application, we need to build a bridge between these two systems, or we need to be able to add this module to our mental health system so that we can put that data in there as an example. Or another one, perhaps you only need to know total suspensions for all grades, but you'd like to know the percentage of students who are female, but that data doesn't actually talk, right? You just say, well, we know that they were suspended. We didn't ever tie that data to gender identification. So you haven't yet collected that data, but you again can infer based on the data that you do have, or maybe even data that a similar organization has collected that maybe mirrors your student body. Or you can say, what we can see over here is that in our community that 50% of, let's choose another number, 30% of the students encountering this challenge are female. And so we're going to infer, even though our data sets don't talk to each other, we're going to infer that 30% of the students also encountering this challenge are female. Okay. And you're trying to get data to be apples to apples, because the reality is we just don't always have the data that we need. Okay. Primary data is not always comparable to national data because it's collected and aggregated differently. Nonetheless, try your best to think of your audience. If you're applying for a national grant, presenting your local data, your primary data, in comparison to national data. You will see that over and over again. They're going to say, well, tell us what your local data is. But you want to point it and compare it to the national data, because there has already been so much research about, well, when national data says this, it means this thing. Well, our local data says this. So we feel like we can extrapolate or infer that it would then mean similarly. Okay. We'll also discuss this last point in a little bit more greater detail when we get to examples. But for now, suffice to say, you'll want to keep in mind your audience. You want to make sure that you read and reread those grant opportunities and the guidelines provided by the funder to know what they care about. So then you can frame your program accordingly using data that showcases that which the funder cares about, and also speaks to that impact, that third section, that evaluation that your program will be able to make. Next slide. Now, some things to consider as you move forward in looking at the data you have. You want to make sure you also determine your organizational capacity for data collection as you propose a new program. If this program is funded, you will surely need to report on it. So if your data collection team is already overwhelmed or will not be able to meet these deadlines, you should consider actually requesting additional help within the budget of your proposed project. For instance, can you provide the data but don't have an in-house expert for evaluation? You might consider seeking and maybe proposing an external evaluator as part of your budget. Or will you need additional help for data collection because you're planning on expanding or sending out a new survey? So you might consider adding staff or even consultants to your proposed project. Other things that examples that I gave might be saying, well, we only have as much funding for this, but this project will cause the way we analyze the data to take so much more time than our current staff has the capacity for. I've dealt with a lot of organizations who are trying to, they've collected all the data they need to collect, but it's really the analysis of the data and really trying to figure out what it means for them that really causes that, them to not have enough time. And they put someone into their grant for data analysis, or how do we disaggregate this data in a way that makes sense, not just for us, maybe as a school district, but for our various partners that we may be working with, such as our police departments or mental health agencies. Okay. So the proposal stage, or even this planning stage that you guys are looking at right now, is a great time to consider the complexity of the resources you will need to actually implement your project. Next slide. So now if you have collected your data, it will be important to take some time to really map out the most important features of it to present within your proposal. A well-crafted proposal uses data as another narrative element that illustrates and complements what is written. The way data is presented should clearly convey a story, and not to sound too repetitive, but again, consider your audience. Imagine that you're having a conversation with them. But keep in mind that this conversation that you're having, they're having that exact same conversation with 10, 20, or 30 other districts, okay? So the data that you present will paint a picture, but it should also be understandable, easy for them to be able to internalize and take with them throughout your proposal. You want to do things like add titles to your tables and cite your sources. You want to include short descriptions for figures and graphics along with that title on top. And if you include a figure, remember that some reviewers will only be able to see it in black and white. So color contrast will not matter as much as grayscale. Keep in mind formatting guidelines, of course, because you don't want to have all the hard work be sent to you without review, because the presentation of it is not compliant. And where we really see that is people who try to cheat in the margins. Okay, they want to make their table too wide, or they want to have that that image be able to take part of the margin space. And that's a no-no on federal grants, okay? So with those pointers in mind, let's kind of talk about some of the best practices and examples around data use and presentation. Next slide. So let's talk about some quick do's and don'ts, if you will, on curating and presenting data. I have these examples side to side as a quick reference of, frankly, what I wish I knew before I first researched my very first grant proposal. Because frankly, I probably committed all of these don'ts at some point, and for various reasons, because there are reasons to do some of these don'ts. But in general, the more you can kind of avoid them and stay on the right-hand side of this slide, the better off you're going to be. In addition, as a consultant, I have definitely seen the good and the bad, including as a federal reviewer. So first of all, you will now see why it's so important to have the who, what, when, and where questions answered, okay? The first best practice is really to narrow down your data to the geographic location of your program. Now, this truly depends on what you are doing, but it will help reviewers understand the breadth and the depth of your program. This could be a county, a city, maybe 3 or 4 zip codes, a neighborhood, a state, or even a tri-state area that does not encompass even a whole state, or maybe you're a metropolitan statistical area. It will really depend, but you'll want to make it clear from the data you present what that area is. Now, if you're focusing on maybe just one neighborhood, but then you present state level data, a reviewer may be confused, and you may literally have to say, we don't have this data by the neighborhood, but the closest is X, okay? So that you can guide the reviewer as you go, okay? You also want to be able to make that clear about whatever the entirety of your program is. Once you have a good grasp of that data and you can narrow down your geography and present a point of comparison, you can better situate your data and program on that larger topic or issue you're going to be addressing. So, for example, if parts of your program will address rural service gaps, you'll want to compare rural versus urban and suburban options. If there are poverty or racial ethnic metrics that are more or less prevalent in your area that will play into your program, you'll want to show why and how that area you're serving really stacks up against that wider issues that may be more familiar to that reviewer. Keep in mind that they are reviewing proposals from all across the country. This type of comparison really weaves in an impact to the total overall story you're trying to tell. I like to take a look at all my available data sources first, figure out what restrictions they use, and then try to match up my more flexible data sources so that I have good comparisons. For example, we have community violence data in my community by police station, and each station has a geographic region that they cover. While I typically line these up to our elementary school boundaries, it gets a little messier with the wider middle school and high school boundaries. But if I dig into the areas that my police department considers to be hotspots, these are more closely aligned with various school boundaries because they're done by neighborhoods. And a lot of times that's how our school boundaries are as well. Second, you're going to want to add percentages whenever possible. Raw numbers, of course, are valuable, but percentages actually tell the story, interestingly enough, more specifically. The reason for this is because some smaller school districts are nervous about comparing their data to districts or schools of a different size. They frequently tell me, well, we don't think we're going to be competitive because we don't have as many issues in our district or community or school. But when you look at the percentage, some of them are experiencing much higher percentage of their student body with challenging mental health, justice-involved students, behaviors, etc. Now, a third is that comparison point is helpful to the reader in understanding the extent of the problem or issue. For instance, if you're addressing mental health, you could include county rates versus state and national rates to showcase differences. If these differences are wide and your program is addressing that gap in some way, you have a perfectly crafted need statement that can then later be part of an impact or final report. Fourth, be aware of the source of your data that you're citing. Obviously, reputable data is always best. Some of the suggested resources are things that we are providing in the handouts that will come along with these slides. However, there are many more reputable data sources. In particular, if you're applying for a federal grant, it is good to include data that the federal government already produces because this has already been previously vetted. The same goes for things like peer-reviewed journals. They've been vetted. Not always the case. Newspapers, magazines, at times, they present data designed to be more of an engaging way, and it could contain biases, or maybe it's not fully interpreted in a way that the researcher intended it. So you're going to want to kind of maybe steer clear of that kind of data source. The fifth is using outdated data. An example is using what's called the decennial census data, which was last published in 2020. And a lot of people say, but that's only 3 years old. But I want you to think about what all was going on in 2020. That may not want to be the story that you want to tell now. Perhaps you have some data tables that have been produced already. It would be a good idea to consult, again, the data source to make sure that's the most recent data available. Because if there's more recent data, you may want to update what you already have. It's also a good idea to have recent journal articles cited. Check the bibliography you're using or pulling data from, and pull out information as needed from outdated sources and refresh it with more recent information. Now, to gather this information, you can search by topic, or especially you might find things by author. Someone always asks me, by the way, how far back is too far? Ideally, for these types of projects, I'm really looking for maybe the last 3 years or even 5 years, because there's been a lot of work done in this space during that time frame. Any research that's 10 years or older, you're really going to need to take a close look at it to see if there isn't something newer. Additionally, this may be relevant for, let's say, the research or evidence that supports the program or activities that you want to implement with your program. I try to find research with data on program effectiveness within this time frame. My last point here really refers to what we call a data dump, and that's really adding all of the data points that you uncovered during your research. This can be a common don't, right? Because you really can get bogged down with what are the data points that are the most important. I have seen needs sections that just list and list and list and list and list data, but it's not relevant to their program. So it's really helpful early on to think of almost like an outline of what your goals of your program are going to be proposing, and that which data then further serves that goal. And the data should be in support of that who, what, when, and where of the program. Pick the most impactful data and be mindful that you're not going for breadth, but what you're really trying to do is address the specific objectives of the funding solicitation you're responding to. So if the goal of the funder is to improve mental health outcomes, and your program is, for example, to provide more mental health providers, then your data should be around those two items specifically. Adding too much data can, in fact, be detrimental, as it could confuse the reader on really what are the most important elements of your program. Now, let's take a look at some examples. Next slide. I will share that these are publicly available examples, since my work as a grant writer, of course, is confidential. However, these examples do offer some important points to be mindful of. This slide shows a table crammed with longitudinal information that's general. It's unclear that there's a point behind it, but it appears as a summary of a 13-year span of homicide victims in Richmond. The text around this chart mentions nearly all of the homicide victims aged 10 to 24 are African American. Aha! This is the relevant information that this slide is telling us. However, from quickly looking at this table, you would not immediately know what the relevant information is. There are several ways of kind of tweaking the information. One could simply be highlighting the column by maybe using a bold face or font, or a different formatting in the table that highlights race. While there is nothing wrong with the table, there are ways of making this data work better for the point you're trying to make. Next slide. Moving on to graphics. Heat maps are a great way to present data. This map is really more descriptive than anything. It's showing poverty measures in children. So the map shows that every state has children living in poverty. But what is the focus? Is there a point of comparison? If it was in the grant application, I would probably highlight the state where the program is going to be taking place. When considering the text surrounding this map, the text mentions that poverty in America disproportionately affects children of color. It also talks about neighborhoods with concentrated poverty and mentions that Black and American Indian or Alaskan Native children are 7 times more likely to live in these communities compared to white children, and Latino children about 5 times more likely. So the map itself does not in any way hint at the fact that the focus of the information presented around it includes a disproportionate burden of poverty in different racial groups. That's why this is actually an example of too much information. It shows data that's not necessarily in support of the exact overall point you're trying to make. That point should be clear through the use of data and graphics. And perhaps maybe we zoom in on a neighborhood and instead talk about those hot spots and what are the demographics in those zones within your community. Next slide. Now I present to you the infographic. This is another great way of showing lots of data. Infographics are eye-catching, they're engaging. The fact that they include graphics and text makes them easier to digest. However, they can be complicated to produce, and they can take a lot of space in your narrative. But if you have the time and skills and the solicitation allows it, an infographic can be a great way to pack lots of information and tie it all together. This one is very general. It presents broad information on the topic of mental health. It covers different types of mental health disorders, different age groups, different institutional settings. For this infographic to be useful for a grant application, it would actually need to narrow its focus to maybe a particular geographic area, age, or demographic grouping, or frankly, both, right? Next slide. So now we have an example that tells the story of a public school's reporting of a variety of discipline problems that occurred at least once a week. Here it shows that some of the discipline problems have improved over time. For example, student bullying and student sexual harassment are reported at smaller rates in the later years, or that dark green bar. However, there are other problems that have worsened over time based on reports. For example, you have issues such as cyberbullying, which has gotten much worse, or even student verbal abuse of teachers, which looks to have worsened over time as well. Here you have some interesting data bits, which is not a lot to say about this data that would point to a specific need somewhere. This is an overall aggregate of data that, if used in a grant application, does not tell much to a reviewer or a person in the decision-making role. So this can be used as an illustration that should include a point of comparison that is clearly identifiable. So in this way, you want to create your own graphics or your own tables that you can use several sources of data all at once to explain a need or a problem that you're addressing. And while this chart looks good and can be lifted from a report, it may not actually serve you well if it's not tied to the particular issue you are addressing. Now let's go to the next slide and take a look at some examples that do it all. Here in this first wonderful example, we again have an infographic. This time we get very quickly an overview of what the data will be covering. It's something as simple as asthma, right? The infographic quickly makes the case that the disease represents a problem in the state. We know a little bit about how asthma, the issue, affects different types of populations with the state, and we give a comparison to the national average. We have raw numbers, we have geographic representation of percentages, we have percentages outlined in the geographic representation, and in all, we can understand the extent of the problem simply by looking at the data presented here. It's easy to digest and paints a clear message of the extent of the problem. This is what you're aiming for. It does not have to be in infographic form. You can certainly present this data as a table and use some eye-catching elements, again, like a bold font or a grayscale background, wherever you would like to draw your reader's attention. Next slide. Now, in this next example, I show you a graph. This example is also easy to understand. It's a succinct way to present longitudinal data, and you get to see that there's a wide gap between a geographic location and a national average. This is a great way of showcasing a problem that is more acute within a geographic location, which can help you make the case for the need for your program. Now you can tell the story around this fact by either showing the historical trends that have led to this gap or explaining how that gap may be narrowed through your programmatic work. In this way, you'll be using data to make the case for your program and support your solution. Next slide. Tables are also very accessible. You can combine data from different sources in a table to offer a quick comparison. Or, as shown in this case here, you can offer separate tables to show different themes within a geographic location. In this case, the focus is on Clark County, vis-a-vis the state of Nevada and the national averages. The first table puts a spotlight on mental health disparities to show the need for more access to mental health providers. The health outcomes highlighted include the percentage of adults with mental health illnesses and suicide rates. Now the table suggests there's a correlation between health providers per capita and the health outcomes observed. It tells a story of a county in need of additional providers. This data has already painted a picture for us about Clark County. Even though we're not there, we can understand there's a need for more mental health providers. Now, the next table gives us more general information about that county by looking at socioeconomic indicators. We see that people are faring somewhat worse than average at the state and national levels in indicators such as unemployment, educational attainment, and health insurance rates. So now we know that not only are there issues with mental health to be addressed, but there are also structural factors that are impacting these mental health outcomes as well. We're getting a fuller picture of the needs that are in that county. Now we can place ourselves in that place, and we can understand a bit deeper the challenges that people face in that region. I like this example because it's really quite general. You can see here that this would support a number of activities and different types of programs that are seeking to address mental health. This type of data would support, in general sense, several objectives, such as increasing the number of mental health professionals or creating more partnerships with mental health providers to shore up capacity, maybe via telehealth medicine. Or you could make the case the need to create additional training programs in that area for social workers or a range of mental health providers. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and yet this is specific data. This is how you would use data to help you tell a story and support your overall case to seek funding. Now, before I move on to the next part, I want to say a few words about all of these data visualizations. Please do not just drop tables into your narratives and assume that the reviewer will understand what you are trying to convey with quality titles. You'll want to tell them what you're going to present in the paragraph before the visualization, and then lead them to the part of the visualization that is the most important information. And then after the visualization, you'll want to draw the conclusion from the data that makes your point. Poorly explained data can kill your proposal if you don't tell the reviewers exactly what point you're trying to make with the visualization, because otherwise they're just looking at it willy-nilly and they're coming up with maybe even their own conclusions about what you're trying to say. Okay, so then let's go on. I'll answer the Q&A question when I finish this next section. Okay. So now that you have a handle on where to get your data, let's put it together to create a story that highlights the best of your organization, while really also presenting to the funder the why of the program. Remember, your funder, whether a foundation, the federal government, the state government, will care about the impact of your program. And the most expedient way is to show that through data. Okay, next slide. While showing need is definitely important, most funders will care that their investment is a sound one, and that's not any different with the federal government. So the bottom line here is outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. Make sure the data you provide is tied to the ultimate outcomes you want to see and directly reflects the linkages between the activities you will be doing and the final outcomes you're seeking. You want to highlight with data the improvements you're seeking. You can focus on the population you're serving and showcase how the activities you're going to be doing are going to improve their outcomes. Remember, the best way to do that is through data. Social impact that is aligned with your funder's goals will prove to be a winning strategy. So use data in service of that overall strategy. Next, relevant data will showcase the feasibility of the outcomes you're seeking. If your programmatic goals are, for instance, to improve mental health outcomes, and the data you show paints a picture of slow decline, you'll also want to show how you will collect and aggregate data that's in line with the data you've shown, and that your goals are in line with those overall trends you've shown in the data. So going back to the example, if there's a slow decline in mental health outcomes, your programmatic goals probably want to be modest in their metrics because your data will show the feasibility of your program. Both no metrics or inflated metrics really are red flags when it comes to feasibility. Finally, the evaluation section and the outcomes section will connect the dots between the data you have presented and the overall impact of your program. In telling a story with numbers, you want to make sure that they are all connected to what will be the apex of your proposal. That is the evaluation and outcome section, where you're going to make the case for the impact of your project. Once you've highlighted what is needed in a particular geographic region for a subset of population, and you list all the activities you're going to carry out through the lifespan of your proposed project period, you will get to how you will know that your project has succeeded. This is where all your data points can be summarized. Next slide. So we've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. It can be overwhelming for those of you who may be new to grants to think about how to use all this data in an impactful way to support whatever grant proposal or proposals that you plan in this next year. And we've talked about supporting the need or the why your program is needed. We've also talked about how you're going to show that your program impacted the population. So, where can you start? Okay, start with the overall objective of the program, the what. This will be how you are going to boil down the entire program to a single idea. We will do X so that Y decreases or increases or does not happen. This core what will lead you to other questions. What you will do for a specific population in a contained geographic area. The issue or problem you are addressing with your program will be one of the initial points of the program, which will then later lead you to who you are serving and where you are serving them. These are your initial boundaries of where to begin. And once you collect the internal data you have, you can start to see how other data will complement what you have. Where are those initial comparisons? How can you make sure you convey the activities that will really make up the bulk of your program, then into a graph or a chart? These are good places to start. However, I will say, after years of working on this and working alongside many talented grant professionals, there is no single roadmap for acquiring the data you need for a proposal. At times, you're going to feel like it's too much and you're going to have to edit it down. Other times, you're going to feel like you don't have enough and you're going to be complementing what you have, maybe even with anecdotal data. As long as the data you present is in direct service of the program or activities you're seeking to fund, this is the crux of using data for telling your story. Think of that program as not only the outcomes you want to achieve, but also those activities. For instance, if you're seeking to improve mental health outcomes and one of the activities is to add more mental health counselors in an area that is under-resourced, then some of the data you present can make the case for why that activity will produce the outcome you are seeking. Also, a reminder for any of you who are out there who are truly ambitious and would like to get a grant application done in just a couple of weeks, collecting and curating the type of data that illustrates your project well takes time. It's also very rarely a one-man show. We often help clients do this through a series of meetings, and the data is imbued in several different sections of the overall proposal, as I mentioned. Collecting and presenting it sometimes is even trial and error, much like writing. You will find yourself editing and moving things around. However, if you have enough time to do this, and maybe someone with aptitude for data analysis, you can also include data that speaks, like the infographic presented earlier, or some of the charts showing longitudinal data. In addition, presenting data is part of what really makes a persuasive case for grant funding. You are, remember, in essence, using data to persuade your reader why they should fund you right now. There is an immediacy to this. And there is a funny thing about persuasion and data. If the person pulling it together and presenting the data doesn't really believe in the problem, the way they present the data will not be persuasive. So if you have the option, just another thing to think about. Be careful who's collecting and writing about this data for you. Otherwise, they can taint and introduce bias into your results. Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground, so I'm going to leave a few minutes to answer any of the questions you may have. Next slide. Okay, I know we had some here in the Q&A. We talked about the guidelines for each grant. Again, you're going to use a combination of what's listed on Greenlight Grants Initiative's website, where they have grant opportunities. And then I would go to grants.gov. It's a free web portal, and you're looking for ones with those same titles, but that have been archived, which means they're from a previous year versus current. A lot of times there won't be ones that are out for this particular current year. In terms of audience, which types of individuals are selected to be on the review panel? This is a really great question. We've talked so much about audience that it's a good question, right? So the one thing when you think about with the audience is that there could be grant professionals on there. There could be people who work in school safety. There could be mental health professionals on there. There could be people from the criminal justice system. It kind of depends on really which grant you're applying for. If I'm applying for a grant to the Department of Justice, I'm more likely to have maybe 2 out of my 3 reviewers be someone who's in the justice system, and that third person to be maybe someone who's from a school doing dropout prevention, maybe even someone who is in a community organization who's being added to that team of 3. And most of the time you are looking at teams of 3. So on the Department of Education, you're more likely to have 2 of those people on the education side, and that third person to be giving that broader perspective. If you take a look at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, you're going to have a stronger group of people who are in the mental health space, and then maybe you'll have somebody from a school, or maybe you'll have someone from the criminal justice side. Okay. So prevention. So this is an interesting question. What about projects that are for prevention? What kind of data do you recommend? So with prevention, I'm a lot of times taking a look at what the research says, point toward protective factors. And that's really kind of or resiliency factors. A lot of times I'm taking a look at strengthening systems, and I'm pointing to the fact that research says that these are the things we really need to protect our children. And we don't have a lot of data about maybe a lot of incidences that are happening in my community or in my particular school, but maybe they're nearby us. Or we know that our district is just like that district down the road who just had an incident happen. So we know it could happen here. I had a lot of people who've done comparisons they've compared their data to the Sandy Hook or to Columbine or to other school shootings that have happened, and said, our statistics look just like theirs. It's just that they've had it happen, and we want to make sure that we're prepared for it to happen. We want to make sure that we have the hardening, the training, all of those types of things to help the people in our district be prepared for when these things are happening. I've also taken a look at some of the information that points to the idea that we know that these risk factors are increasing. We know that we're on a sliding scale towards the potential for a problem. Because our risk factors are increasing, we want to be ahead of the game. And so we start talking about these particular programs are designed towards the prevention of getting to those acute activities. Whether you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or whether you're thinking about multi-tier systems of support, MTSS, you have a lot of things that may be tier 1 that are prevention, and then you might have other activities that you're doing that are addressing students who have some risk factors, then who are ones who are experiencing some challenges, and then some who are maybe even currently in the criminal justice system. And it shows that you're taking a look at the whole pathway, even if your numbers at the top of that are very small. Okay, great question. Okay, next question. If you're creating a new program, is data or narrative more important? If you are on the cutting edge and you are creating something that's brand new, then I would tell you that you have to be able to talk about what that cutting edge thing is based in, and be able to do some comparison, that we did this, it didn't work, or we did to this point, but it's not really working for this population, we're having to do comparison. So you could really find yourself going through a lot of data to find very specific data points that make your argument. And then your narrative ends up having to spend a lot more time wrapping around and explaining, because you don't just have a cookie cutter solution. So from my perspective, it's the key data points and then a lot of narrative that I think would point that direction. If you are simply saying, well, we're adopting a new program, then you're pointing more towards finding out how that program will meet the need. And so your need data is still very important. Okay.
Julie, thank you so much
We're running out
for
of
such
time.
an incredible webinar. I know there's still a lot of questions out there, so please email info@greenlightsgrantinitiative.org with any additional questions, and we'll be working with Julie to answer them for you. We've been putting out a FAQ document a few days after each webinar, so you guys can have the questions you asked and questions others asked. And we know Julie's very helpful, so we're so grateful for her and her time. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon quickly at the Just Keep Living Foundation, and she'll finish it off for us.
Hi, you all. Thank you so much. Julie, thank you so much. Micah, thank you. We're just very, very grateful for everybody on here today. I am the executive director of Camilla and Matthew McConaughey's Just Keep Living Foundation, and we're so appreciative of McAllister and Quinn, and could not have done this without Forward Global as well. So we really, this is obviously, you guys saw Matthew in his video, but this is so close to Camilla and Matthew's heart, and they just really, we all do from the foundation want to make sure that these dollars get used to help keep our kids safe, obviously, most importantly, and that we are really giving you guys the tools to help find this funding and these grants. So please know that we're here for you. Anytime, go on our website, chat us, send us messages. We have a great team, thanks to Forward Global, and we will get back to you. But thank you very, very much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the Monday. And definitely tune in to our next one, which will be our webinar on November 15th, which is Understanding Logic Models. So we hope you come back, and we're always looking for feedback. So feel free to share your feedback with us as well. Thank you so much.